a piece called A Transatlantic Turbine, Eric Mottram in the World Today. It may turn out to be a longer piece, maybe book length. And certainly it will open with two quotes, one of which we have already heard today several times. There is nothing more exciting than something you don't know about. Eric's quote. And the second one is also by Eric. It says, I suppose everything I do is examination of tyranny. The last time I spent a few working hours with Allen Ginsberg was in the summer of 1997 at Naropa University, where I was teaching for a week at the Jack Kerouac Institute of Disembodied Poetics. I always thought that name was a misnomer, as poetics to me are profoundly essentially, if I believed in essences, a matter of embodiment, of immanence, and thus the opposite of disembodied. I think Eric would agree. Ginsberg wasn't disembodied either that morning, but already I came to realize when I thought back on it, sick in his body and exhausted from his constant toils. So he was irritated and grumpy. Our discussion made him even grumpier. As an official advisor for Jerome Rothenberg's and my Poems for the Millennium anthologies, I had brought Allen the manuscript of Volume 2 and asked him for his advice, if not his imprimatur. He had read it quickly, called and summoned me for that morning session. The manuscript had clearly exacerbated his grumpiness. We talked for more than 2 hours about the book, and Allen was insistent that he wanted us to remove a number of poets. I won't name them by name, suffice it to say that they belong to the L persuasion, the language poets. And replace them, he suggested, with what I would call the NB persuasion, the neo-beats. I tried to explain gently that this was not going to happen, as both Jerry and I were adamant that our choices were justified in terms of what the most intense and highly charged poetry of that moment was. It was a standoff. Ginsey, who had loved the first volume, was fuming, and I wasn't sure how to handle this. Wanting to move the conversation away from that delicate matter of contemporary inclusions, I told Ginsberg that we had decided to dedicate the volume to our good friend Eric Mottram, who had passed away 2 years earlier in 1995, just as the first volume came out and we had started into this one. Ginsberg's face lit up. He smiled broadly. The clouds above and inside our heads started to dissipate. We were back on a sunny terrain of agreement and pleasantness and continued to talk about Eric for the next half hour. Thank you, Eric, I said to myself, and thought, wow, Mottos is still able to act at a distance 2 years after calling it Splitsville. Thank you, thank you. The book would come out the following year with, as dedication, for Eric Mottram, 1924-1995, poet, friend, and teacher, and with the following quote from Eric's work as epigraph: that all created life be rescued from tyranny, decay sloughed for a share in magnificence, hoof thunder, silence earth, pines and birches across the taiga. In more than one way, neither Eric nor Jerry nor I ever believed there was one way, one single way, in which anything in the world worked or should work. The Poems for the Millennium anthologies were and remain a profoundly Mottramian enterprise. This, not in any linear teaching student lineage, even if I was briefly Eric's actual student here at King's, and Eric, in an indirect way, and one he would acknowledge, studied, as I did, the early groundbreaking gathering Jerry Rothenberg published in '69 under the title Technicians of the Sacred, but in the sense of an action of conviviality, to use a term Eric liked and got from Ivan Illich. What Eric said about creating poetry is easily applicable to Jerry's and my creating of anthologies. And I quote Eric, "Discovery and recognition of the discovered, freedom to explore, and the will to new form. This is the poet's responsibility more than ever. And Eric would always, with that word responsibility, remind us of Robert Duncan saying, responsibility is the ability to respond. The Transatlantic Turbine of my title is, of course, a reference to the title of a volume of poems by Ed Dorn, we just saw his picture, who was then in the UK at Essex, published by Fulcrum Press in 1967, Stuart Montgomery's press, who was a friend and at times a collaborator of Eric's. The opening line of that book, "Only the illegitimate are beautiful," could by itself be a fascinating way of going at thinking about Mottram's take on the legal and the range of his areas of thinking. 1967 was also the year I, for the first time, crossed the North Atlantic from Luxembourg to New York via Iceland, starting me on what is now more than half a century of semi-nomadic circulatory. Immediately, Eric's fascination with and poems about harvest circulation of the blood, the book called Local Movement, come to mind. Semi-nomadic circulatory, I said, and possibly just transhumans moves. This back and forth between Europe and North America I see as one of the profound shared rhymes between Eric's and my own work. It is also why, on whatever side of the Atlantic I may be, Mottram is never far from my mind. But there is also a need to escape the circulatory movement. And in Eric's case, I would like to suggest one of the many points of origins of his thinking and consequent activity is also to be located in the Far East during his years in the Navy towards the end of World War II, the experience of a very young and still green sub-lieutenant who was put in charge, i.e. in a place of authority, of a vessel at war, in a war, and thus of all that a ship represents as a social whole, moving in a wider world of nature, the oceans, and human societies, inimical or friendly ones. And obviously his love for Melville and his close readings of Melville come in there. In a letter to Robert Duncan, he mentions, without going into any details, an event from those years. Quote, "Betrayal is the worst scene. I've always thought so. During the war, I had an experience of utter treachery, and it has been the basis for morality for me ever since." End of quote. In that sense, one of the important figures to look at would be Joseph Conrad, a writer immensely important for Eric. "I'm a Conrad maniac," he said in an interview, and on whom Eric had always promised himself and us to write. If he put it all with words, I believe, because an essay wouldn't have been enough, it would have to be a full book, and time ran out. There are, I believe, some writings on Conrad in the archives, which I'd love to see whenever I have a free day here. It is important never to see Eric Mottram's work as bipolar in the literal sense of it moving between England and the United States, as that would be a major oversimplification and deny the core drive to multiplicity in his work. Beyond the already mentioned Far East wartime experience, that also post-World War II and nearly surreally include a visit to Angkor Wat, entailing a chance meeting with Joseph Campbell, the man who, thinking about myth, is the exact opposite of Eric's. His teaching stints at the University of Malaya in Singapore, which is where he started the lifelong teaching of American literature, after first poke at it the previous year in Zurich, and then Groningen in the Netherlands, and his later travels to Hyderabad, the Tunis expedition, which acquainted him with North Africa. He and I talked much about that area of the world and the authoritarian results of decolonization and the wars of independence during and after my 3 years teaching in Constantine, Algeria. But Eric was also strongly engaged with continental Europe, from French poetry to Hungarian film and a range of things in between. I can only imagine how saddened he would be with current developments. And anybody teaching cultural studies in that area would do well right now to use his Seasons of Monsters poems, dedicated to film director Miklos Janso and writer Gülya Hernadi, and show the latter's 1965 film The Roundup and his 1986 film Season of Monsters, on which Eric's title is based. These are major statements against Stalinism, and they need to be revived today and seen as statements against the rising fascist tide. Eric, a lifelong democratic socialist, always knew and taught that Stalinism and fascism were identical. There is a certain amount of irony, not a mode I feel positively about, in the fact that in 1980, Eric published an essay entitled Fears of Invasion in American Culture in the Hungarian Quarterly. Invasion phobias that the opening of Eastern Europe in and post-1989 seem to banish, but that lie at the very roots of the current turn towards neo-fascism in places like Hungary, Poland, and so on, and maybe even in Brexit UK. You wonder what that has to do. Permit me to make a collagist and in that sense a Mottramian use of Eric's essay on Charles Olson's Apollonius of Tyana, which very few of you will know. It was published in March 1973 in issue 3/4 of my magazine Six Pack. Rereading it last week as I was preparing this talk, it struck me how much what Eric described as Olson's view of himself as Apollonius corresponded in fact to, I believe, how Eric needed to view himself qua poet and active man in the world. Let me collage several pages of the essay, replacing or doubling the name Olson with that of Mottram. And I think you'll see what I mean by this non-autobiographical self-definition, or better, a definition of aims and stances. So this essay, Olson's on Apollonius and Eric's on Olson, is Mottram's plan of action. It is a proposal for defining the active sage, the image of the man he wished to be. Apollonius is the corrector of government rather than the Promethean Caesar of fire. Olson Mottram is not revolutionary. He is not the stealer of Jovian energy, which Olson misunderstood Robert Duncan to claim he was. The scene occurs at the beginning of causal mythology and is discussed in further detail in the Mottram-Duncan correspondence volume. He, Olson Mottram, is rather like Pound, a man who once hoped to affect the power structure through the firm presentation of complex information about the nature of culture. That combination of poetry and history Olson works for in the special view of history. Neither Olson, Mottram, nor Pound are politicians or philosophers. Neither of those careers in public debate and intrigue concern their central action. That of Apollonius in Olson Mottram's work, where poetry is, their definition, is a compendium of erotic and social information in action, moving out from the figure Olson makes in Apollonius, quoting, the classical proportional figure of a man bound by a circle, geometric and enunciative man, measurer and to be measured, shaping himself with greater accuracy than usual in man, moving out from the center of birth, Tyana, Worcester, London, as far as any particular man can go. In many of his writings, Olson Mottram is concerned with migration in the forming of cultures. Here he is concerned with a single man's movement, and what is more, a man singular in a particular sense, since Apollonius is a man without family and with an apparently highly reduced sexuality, although Olson Mottram does not indicate so much overtly. The map of this figure's movement defines coasts and topographies, periploi, charts of coasts, and topographical maps. And as such, it also relates deeply to a major design of Pound's Cantos, whose structure is, in one sense, Odysseus's periploi, the making of maps and movements between cultures. The place of birth is, quote, too close for him to know not what it is, but how to gauge it. The body, the physical thing, has to be explored rather than assumed. The extensions of these two bases become the discovery of the nature of the city and the nature of healing. Two ways the unit self moves out into societal relationships. To understand the body and its health, a man must undertake not only its mechanics, but also have a complete knowledge of its behavior, and not only its behavior as a structure in isolation, but within an environment. That's where Eric quotes Olson, and let me read that quote from Olson's text. That how a tree sways is as much of the matter as is how you sway. How any hanging thing is as you hang by the hook of gravitation. Hang as a pendulum swings. How to heal is also how you eat and how you found out how, somehow, to maintain your resistance, of which act secrecy is an honest part, his Pythagorean teachers taught him. How to act fiercely but with dignity. The Apollonius movement, then, is living ecologically. Man has no right to use anything but what, like a crop or the wool of a sheep, can grow again, like trees can grow if topsoil is not the price paid for cutting a stand off, as war cuts off men after their mothers can bear again. That's Olson, but could be Eric, very much so. Morality is defined ecologically and not in terms of division, conquest, or conflict, or any of the 19th century grids of permissive behavior, Darwinism, Marxism, Freudian mythology, and Viennese psychology. Apollonius achieves his aim. He wore his mind firmly as at Antioch he had found out how to wear his body. Olson, Mottram restate Henry Adams's multiverse and William James's pluralistic universe based on pragmatic method in terms of the post-1946 era of nucleic and ecological disasters. For Olson, Mottram, the body and mind, movement and location, the world and Gloucester, Herne Hill are parts of a single action towards decentralized mutuality. Quote from Olson, how now he took it that man and his world too were a sheaf at the harvest, just as seed and the earth were blackly joined in growing. Olson, Mottram lie therefore within the crux. On what scale can we live in the universe if we are not to disperse our energies in false goals of mistaken unity, system, tragic sacrifice, or nihilistic self-reliance? His aim, can be either of them, is mutual aid and non-coercion. That no man should impose his mode of life on others is the conviction arising from confidence. That is a very important word in Mottram's work, confidence. Goes all the way from having confidence to the question of the confidence man, in Melville. So a very lovely, complex double. It's another chapter. Also, Mottram's aim is to reach through universals and unities, not simply to a nervous sense of multiverse, as in the education of Henry Adams, but to a definition of a state of happiness, which recalls Tom Paine rather than Thomas Jefferson. Energy is not to be repressed for civilization under leadership, but taken from where it lives, a part of the daimonos, since, quote, the recognition of the daimonial nature in anything, including ourselves, is wisdom, and only this guileless path give health. That is again back to Tiana. End of that triple working there between those three. Thus, at the core of Eric Mottram's various activities, the cultural studies, the lit crit, if you want to call it that, the poetry, the public readings and performances, which are essential in his action, I see the drive and necessity to keep the multiple alive and open within an ecology of healthy energy. Let me quickly delineate some of the ways he did this in terms of the poetry and then the political thinking in the essayistic work, having, however, to simplify and reduce horribly because of our time limits. Eric's love of multiplicity as the locus of a possible sanity, as a counteraction to reductive discourses, mythological or scientific, mythoscientific, away from the one that need to ascertain that whatever we deal with, we are careful not to reduce to any singular, for our ease or for our peace of mind. And I think Eric would agree that peace of mind equals death of mind. To use Deleuze-Guattari's lovely formulation, always think the multiple as n minus 1. That is, think the multiple while subtracting the one, i.e. the possibility of the singular, of the absolute reduction or the reduction of to the absolute. In a wonderful way, Eric speaks to this in his interview with Wolfgang Goetschacher when he remembers seeing Gilgud in Macbeth as a young man. Quote, "It really hit me what was being delivered orally from the stage. It was really like hearing incredible music or something. He seemed to bypass the intellect and get into whatever is inside. It used to be called soul or psyche or something horrid. I hope I don't have either of those. Just ordinary things like a liver, stomach, or heart will be quite enough." Note that he doesn't replace the soul or psyche with a single organ, but immediately with a multiplicity of organs. This, by the way, can also permit us to quickly sketch a Mottramian critique of tribalism and metaphor. In earlier tribal cultures, the singular referent or incarnation of that soul or transcendental unity can often be a single site, even if a material organ. For example, in Bambara mythology, the liver functions as that singular site. And thus already problematic, and not only because it offers a quick hold for Christian ideologies to invade, colonize, and supersede pagan animism, which, I'm quoting Eric, quoting Lynn Townsend White's essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference towards the feeling of natural objects, to which there is Christianity. Both our present science and our present technology are so tinctured with orthodox Christian arrogance towards nature that no solution for our ecological crisis can be expected from them alone. Tribalism and its various incarnations in the hippie and post-hippie 60s and 70s, in Eric's view, was always problematic because easily turning coercive, backward-looking, and essentially closed on itself. Here is how he put it in a letter to Duncan. Quote, "The tribal doesn't initiate, i.e. make it new. It repeats. The grid goes on and on. The purgation state is tribal in this sense. It needs the linearity of utter reductive continuity. Art is not reductive tribal leavings." This critique of the tribal is becoming more and more urgent today, as the new populisms and nationalisms crowding in on us are exhibiting exactly these tribalistic ideologies, leading inevitably to authoritarianism, as we are witnessing again Poland, Hungary, and in the Trumpian United States. Here I would need to insert a full lecture on Mottram and Burroughs, because if any writer got the political analysis of 20th century America right all the way into our own decades, it is Burroughs. He just forgot to mention that the mugwumps of the Naked Lunch were orange in color. And Mottram's book, The Algebra of Need, from its title in, is still the very best reading of Burroughs because the most politically savvy. In the 90s, there was a series of different, mainly useless Burroughs readings making the round, from the glam rock version to various postmodern theory-based readings, I'll accept an astute near-Deleuzian reading by Timothy Murphy, if you know that book. No, good book. Or by way of the film which has betrayed Eric very much, I think, Burroughs very much. Eric's reading of totalitarian politics, addiction, and sex as connected, those three, politics, addiction and sex are one core that he analyzes. And the other thinkers he points us towards, even if since the 60s and 70s many disappeared from reading lists, are still most useful for an understanding of those mechanisms and for thinking a possible way out. I mean specifically the work of Wilhelm Reich on the origins of fascism and sexuality, so useful then and as well now as it used to be. These books need to be dusted off today. So if I was still teaching, which I'm not, I would bring those books back out with Eric's analysis. The reduction of a confusing and for many scary multiplicity of life forms to a single explanation, to a singular or transcendental unit, is also readable in a wholly different field, that of poetics, specifically in the concept of the metaphor. I don't have the time to go into details, but let me look at what Derrida shows about metaphor in the white mythology, Metaphor in the Text of Philosophy, where he writes that the ultimate structure of metaphor is transcendental. And in his example, in Derrida's example, metaphor means heliotrope, both a movement turned towards the sun and a turning movement of the sun. And sun means unicity, the one, the singular, the white blinding or the black sun, or Godhead. Eric's faith in a multicolored multiplicity of individualities works itself out in poetry as based on many actuals in a complex metonymic relation. As he put it in the Imagination of Synthesis seminar, talking of both teaching and writing and proposing techniques of how to lay out information to get at what is there. That is not the symbols or metaphors of it, but what it is. The poem as map, field informational grid, constellatory action, i.e. non-linear structures in movement. Or elsewhere, he puts it, quoting René Char, the poem is in the act of making itself. It is never made. Thus, a matter of process that has to eschew the fixity of metaphor, that tyrannous all-sublating structure. Or later he writes, quote, fundamentally, the preparations and processes of composition are the composition. The poetic is the visual and spoken composition of thinking, writing, feeling, remembering synthesis, and out of a need to come to terms with one's existence, other than coming to terms with it in prose writing, study, personal relationships, family, students worked with, and so forth. Performing a poem is a further transmission, and the carrying voice is the last genetic act. He also says, around there, I believe with Gertrude Stein that, quote, I write for myself and for strangers, but mostly to a trusted group of people there before you, or holding your work in their hands, before their eyes, or listening. The event is collaboration towards a community of experienced, knowledgeable people, including poets, and not mindless, untrained fans who beg winners and fear losers. This was Eric's side of not suffering fools easily. You know, if you didn't know something, you know, he would point you where you could get it, but if you said you didn't want it, you were out. That was, you know, that very, very sad. In that sense, I would love to put together Eric's essays on poetics, and they're very wide, you know, that metonymic discussions, but also his work on chance operations, his work on mathematical structures as they go, that wide variety of access to forms on how to do this, and this should become a manual to replace the AWP, I mean the writing programs, bad ego, gut poetry ideas of where that art comes from. I was surprised myself. A long time ago, I wrote for Poetry Information a review of an Eric book of, can't remember which one it was, but in the Tyranny book, and I analyzed one of the poems, which was the poem based on Aden Arabi, and Sartre's preface to that book, and realized that close to 80% of Eric's text were quotes from Art and Araby, reorganized, set, phrasally changed, but there it was. Very clearly, that is core to his action. I've quickly, if all too sketchily, tried to show that Eric's work is alive and well in this century too, to reprise the title of a book that honored him at 70, and is in fact completely relevant and much needed for an understanding of our situation and for designing actions that may help us move forward in a positive, healthy, ecologically sound manner. Ecology that nobody spoke of. He spoke of at that time. He had traced that essay I mentioned earlier. So that was some of my own first hearings, beside Gary Snyder's book from in the late 60s into early 70s, where the question of ecology came out, right, was there already very clearly. But here is a caveat. My generation, the generation of Eric's students, I see all the gray heads, is quickly approaching retirement age, if we have not done so, in fact. And the question of transmission is beginning to pose itself most urgently. Let me quote Paul Celan on this, who asks in a poem, "Who will witness for the witness?" You know, as the generations pass. Eric, in his day, very pointedly published with the small independent magazines and book publishers that were outside the mainstream of the capitalist setup, on this or on the other side of the North Atlantic. The idea was that access to his writings, be they essays or poems, should be democratic, free, or as cheap as the mimeograph and photocopy revolution allowed it to be. It is, of course, essential that the institution in which he spent most of his working life, King's College, the place that had brought us together today, take care of and watch over his literary estate. That is obviously one of the core functions and duties of a university. We all, I suggest, are profoundly thankful for this. It is, however, also becoming urgent to find ways to make all of Mottram's work available to a wider audience once again than just to those able to come and do research here in London. There are two ways in which we should address this. First, we need a multi-volume edition of his work. A quick outline. In terms of the poetry, I believe that at this point, a largish selected poems would do the job. It would be ideally called Volume 1 of the collected works, even if it was published after other volumes. Most urgent, in my estimation, are a series of maybe 4 volumes that would gather, 1, the cultural studies essays beyond what was gathered in Blood on the Nash Ambassador, 2, the essays on American poetry, 3, the essays on the new British poetry, 4, essays on poetics of such, the book I already spoke to. That would be the simple, traditional way of doing it. There is, of course, a more complex, more Mottramian way, which would be to create constellatory actions, i.e. volumes that would gather materials from those different genres, poems, poetics, cultural studies, lit-crit essays, with commentaries from letters or from a volume, into gestalts relevant to Eric's specific areas of investigation, such as authoritarianism, health, socialism, etc. Secondly, and this may in fact be done faster and would also rhyme with my title image of the North Atlantic Turbine, and it would please Eric, I think, or Eric's desire to make work available quickly and cheaply, what in his days was the mimeograph revolution, is today the internet. It would be relatively easy and cheap to gather much of the work online and make it available. It could be done here at King's, where the archives are, of course, but it could also be done, at least partially, on the other side of North Atlantic Turbine in the US. Before coming here, I spoke with Charles Bernstein about his need and possibility, and the EPC, the Electronic Poetry Center site, as well as Penn Sound, would be willing to host any amount of Eric's work. The advantage then would also be that eventually the tapes that make up such a major part of Eric's legacy could also be made available. When I was still teaching, I would regularly use my tapes of Eric's 1973 Imagination of Synthesis seminar, and the students loved it. They always loved hearing those tapes for the energy. Eric's voice and the enthusiasm audible in his lecturing, as much as in his poetry readings, was and remains contagious. When I started many years ago a small Mottram page on my website, opening it, you clicked on something that would automatically launch a short sound file, Eric's explosive laughter. That part remained with my University of Albany website and is unhappily no longer active, so Bernstein offered to take it over and relocate it on a Mottram page. There isn't a single simple solution to any of this, but we need a variety of ways of bringing Eric's work into public view, because we need to think and write and act through and with Eric Mottram today more than ever. In 1976, Eric published a sequence of poems under the title A Faithful Private. The poems were composed nomadically between Kent, Ohio in 1974 and London in early 1976. The chapbook, published by Colin Sims's Genera editions, ends with a quote from the German exiled poet Heinrich Heine, which elucidates the title. But I think beyond that can be read as a perfect encapsulation of Eric's own sense of a poet, a writer's life, even if there's a metaphor involved. Quote, "A poet should have on his coffin not a wreath, but a gun, to show that he was a faithful private in the liberation struggles of humanity." End of quote. Eric signed my copy when I passed through London in 1978. For Pierre, back in London for nourishment from Eric. And although he didn't mean it exactly that way, I did feel then that going back to London was exactly for nourishment from Eric. And I feel it today too here among you all. Thank you.